We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism.
Take note of this phrase. Replace the frigidity of unbridled individualism with the warmth of collectivism. On 1st of January 2026, Zoran Mamdani was sworn in as mayor of New York with these very words. Bernie Sanders administered the oath of office. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened the ceremony. And so, a large part of the American left has finally found its model. One that includes universal childcare, municipal supermarkets, free buses, rent freezes, and much more. Basically, they're aiming for what is known as the Nordic welfare state, at least as it appears in the textbooks of the 1980s. Because the truth is, the Nordic model is no longer what it used to be, not to mention that it's disappearing at breakneck speed. And Sweden is, of course, a perfect example. What was for a long time the global epicenter of radical social democracy has been shifting toward a quite different model for years. So much so that now, though you may find it surprising, we can come across headlines like this.
This paragon of collectivism is pivoting toward rugged individualism.
Exactly the opposite of what Mamdani was suggesting. In other words, this new American left, which, keep in mind, is not representative of the Democratic Party as a whole, wants to emulate a model that is basically disappearing because it didn't work. VisualPolitik community, over the past 20 years, Sweden has undergone a capitalist shift, comparable even to that carried out by Margaret Thatcher's United Kingdom, or Roger Douglas's New Zealand. Mind you, it's done so very quietly, with virtually no coverage in the international press, and without many left-wing politicians in the rest of the world even noticing. But it has been a radical change. A shift that Sweden has carried out with the overwhelming support of the country's political forces, including the Social Democratic Party itself. And that's precisely why we wanted to create this video, to tell you about the collapse of one of the West's great myths. One of the greatest processes of political and economic transformation that has taken place right under our noses without practically anyone in the rest of the world noticing. So today, on VisualPolitik, we're going to tell you all about the downfall of the Nordic model. Why did it happen? What price has Swedish society paid? And what can we learn from it? So, get comfortable, this video is a must-watch. Before we begin, let me introduce you to someone. His name is Andreas Cervenka. He is a Swedish business journalist. He lived in California for several years, and when he returned to Stockholm, he wrote this.
The American perspective on Sweden is so far off from reality. We're moving from a society that's like one for all for one, to everyone's on their own.
Keep this quote in mind because it perfectly sums up the transformation we're about to describe. Of course, in order to understand how Sweden got to this point, we have to start much earlier. Much earlier. In the early 20th century, Sweden managed to climb the ranks until, by 1970, it had become the third richest country in all of Europe. And do you know how it did it? Well, mainly through low taxes. Yes, you heard correctly. Sweden became rich through low taxes. But guess what? To better understand this story, we can't stop there. We have to go back 150 years in time. The fact is, a century and a half ago, Sweden was poorer than the Congo. Yes, I know, I'm sure that comes as a surprise, but at the end of the 19th century, Sweden was a destitute country. Life expectancy was half the global average, and infant mortality was 3 times higher than in the rest of the Western world. And what do people do when they're starving in their own country? Well, it stands to reason that they pack their bags. Here's exactly what happened. Between 1820 and 1930, 1.3 million Swedes left the country, almost all of them for the United States. We're talking about 20% of all men in the country, and 15% of all women in the late 19th century packing their bags. It was a brutal demographic drain. The country was in dire straits. People were fleeing without looking back. The future looked bleak. Absolutely bleak. And the question is, how did the Swedes pull themselves out of such a tragic situation? Well, obviously it wasn't a matter of magic. Rather, it had a lot to do with this politician. Johan August Gripenstedt was a Swedish aristocrat who became a minister in his early 30s and served as leader of the moderate liberals. In 2 parliamentary speeches in 1857, he promised that, with free markets and free trade, Sweden could go from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the richest. And so, no sooner said than done. In 1846, the guilds were abolished. In 1864, complete freedom of enterprise was established. In 1865, free trade agreements were signed. And along the way came banking reforms, strong property rights, and much greater commercial freedom. The question is, did the strategy work? Well, it worked better than anyone could have imagined. Between 1870 and 1936, Sweden recorded the highest economic growth in the entire industrialized world. And keep in mind, we're talking about 66 consecutive years at the top. During that time, giants like Ericsson, Electrolux, and Volvo emerged in this country, multinational companies that I'm sure all of you, or at least most of you, are familiar with. The result is that by the 1940s, Sweden was already one of the wealthiest and most prosperous countries on the planet, and it achieved this with a much lower tax burden than existed in the rest of Europe and even in the United States. Nevertheless, the 1960s arrived, and everything changed. The Swedish Social Democratic Party, which had been in power for decades, decided that low taxes weren't enough. They believed it was necessary to build a welfare state befitting the most egalitarian country in the world. And obviously, building something so large had to be paid for, and that's when the escalation began. New taxes were imposed, and virtually all tax rates were sharply raised. The wealth tax skyrocketed. Inheritance tax reached 70% even for spouses and children. And income tax, naturally, also shot up. And what happened to government spending? Well, there was money. So the government began spending lavishly, to the point where public spending reached 70% of GDP in the 1990s. Sweden essentially became a true hybrid between a socialist country and a market economy. Although, to be honest, it was almost more of the former than the latter. For instance, as a comparison, public spending in Spain today hovers around 47% of GDP, which means Sweden was 23 percentage points higher at its peak. The perfect model of collectivism that Mamdani was aiming for. But there was a problem. By tightening the fiscal screw so much, the model began to break down. The economy began to grind to a halt. People who could escape started to flee, and many of those who couldn't began to protest. And you know what? There are two stories that perfectly illustrate the disaster that ensued. The first, the story of this guy you see on the screen, the founder of IKEA, who in 1973, fed up with the Swedish tax authorities, packed his bags and took off for Switzerland. In other words, the country's most successful entrepreneur, a man famous for his frugality, left Sweden so he wouldn't feel completely exploited. And like him, many other business people and entrepreneurs did exactly the same thing. Of course, it wasn't just about the big fortunes. Take, for example, the story of Astrid Lindgren, Sweden's most beloved children's author who wrote Pippi Longstocking. Well, one day, she sat down, crunched the numbers, and was horrified. Because do you know what she discovered? That due to a technicality in her self-employment tax status, between social security contributions and the marginal income tax rate, she was paying a marginal tax rate of 102% on her earnings. In other words, for every additional krona she earned, she had to pay the Swedish tax authorities 1.02 krona. Absolutely crazy. That was Sweden in the late 1970s, a veritable tax hell. And what did good old Astrid do? Well, she did what she did best. She wrote a story, a satirical tale denouncing the situation. Pomperiposa in the Land of Money. The scandal was massive. It sparked a fierce political debate that ended with the Social Democrats' defeat in 1976. Even so, the Swedish model carried on until the 1990s, when it had finally run its course. Countless business people had left the country. Growth was at rock bottom. Income levels were stagnant. Capital flight was devastating the country. The deficit was skyrocketing. And to top it all off, a banking crisis struck. On 16th of September 1992, the Riksbank, Sweden's central bank, tried to defend the krona in the markets, which forced it to raise interest rates wildly. And when I say wildly, I mean drastically. Because do you know what level they reached? 500%. And even that didn't work. VisualPolitik community, it was a total disaster. The country that had once been one of the richest in all of Europe had stopped functioning. Basically, it was falling apart. And it was right at that moment, when all seemed lost, that the two major political forces, the Social Democrats and the Conservatives, sat down and agreed on a solution. They decided to start dismantling the famous Nordic model and to do the opposite of what everyone thinks about Sweden. It was then, at that very moment, that the great transformation began, the silent revolution. 1993. Sweden had just emerged from the worst banking crisis in its history. Debt was out of control, unemployment was skyrocketing, and the krona had plummeted, and international investors weren't willing to give their money away. The pressure was brutal. Everything depended on the changes. But this time, fortunately for the Swedes, the changes came.
Under pressure from investors, the government launched major economic reforms.
Even so, what happened was different from what occurred elsewhere. For example, in Margaret Thatcher's United Kingdom, the austerity measures and reforms sparked a veritable all-out war. Let's just say the miners and the unions launched a full-scale assault on the government, and even that is an understatement. But nothing like that happened in Sweden. The trauma of the 1992 crisis generated a broad social consensus that lasted 20 years. Let's just say the Swedes realized that the changes weren't a matter of choice. They were the only way they had to survive. We saw a good example of this in 1994 with the pension reform. That year, partial capitalization was introduced. A portion of the contributions began to be invested in the financial markets through individual accounts. Historically, this was a red line in politics, and yet, do you know how many parties signed on to that reform? 5. 5 of the 7 parties in the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament. We saw another very clear example in 1997, when the structural surplus rule was adopted. With this rule, Sweden committed to maintaining an average surplus of 1% of GDP over the economic cycle. This has allowed the country to become one of the most financially sound economies in the world. And I'm not exaggerating. Keep in mind that in this country, public debt currently amounts to just over 35% of GDP. In other words, in good years, they save, so that in bad years, things don't spiral out of control. It makes sense, but of course, it has meant having to make cuts, especially when they've also wanted to lower taxes. And by the way, do you know which Prime Minister pushed for this rule? Well, here's the thing. It wasn't a conservative, but Göran Persson, a social democratic leader who led the country from 96 to 2006. I've already told you that there was a broad national consensus around this transformation. In fact, the 2 most liberal tax reforms in Sweden's recent history were proposed by 2 leaders, one from the left and one from the right at different times. On the left, we have Göran Persson, under whose government inheritance and gift taxes were abolished in 2004. They did so, by the way, with a unanimous parliamentary vote. Even the Left Party, the party to the left of the Social Democrats, voted in favour. And here is a curious story. Initially, the tax was scheduled to be abolished as of the 1st of January 2005. However, on 26th of December 2004, a tsunami struck Southeast Asia. Among the victims were 500 Swedish citizens who had been on vacation in Thailand. So the parliament decided to bring forward the abolition of the tax so that it would not affect their families, which of course was basically the same as admitting that this tax was terribly unfair. Shortly thereafter, over on the right, Fredrik Reinfeldt emerged as a leading figure, a conservative who served as a prime minister from 2006 to 2014. Well, in 2007, he pushed for the abolition of the wealth tax. Yes, the very same tax that Spain has now brought back, and that had been in effect in Sweden since 1911. What's more, in 2012, they launched ISK accounts. And what are these accounts? Well, basically, investment accounts where Swedes pay no taxes on capital gains or dividends. A sort of personal and universal SICAV, whose tax-exempt limit keeps growing. And of course, income tax has also been reduced, with the marginal rate dropping from nearly 90 to around 50%. It's still very high, but it no longer bears any resemblance to that Nordic exception. In other words, Swedes today pay much less in taxes. In fact, they pay less in taxes than people do in many other European countries. No inheritance tax, no wealth tax, a personal income tax rate in free fall, a portion of pensions in funded plans, and a tax-exempt investment account. The turnaround has been nothing short of phenomenal. And obviously, the question we have to ask is, what has been the outcome of this 180-degree turn? Well, here the numbers speak for themselves. Take a look. ISK accounts have been such a massive success that today, Swedish households have more than half of their financial assets invested in the stock market. And how much do other Europeans have? Well, the average is 25%. Thanks to these accounts, Swedish families have accumulated more than $200 billion, nearly 30% of the country's GDP. This figure is also rising rapidly and is bringing many other benefits. For example,
Sweden now has the deepest capital markets in Europe.
These days, Sweden is becoming one of Europe's leading financial centers, and its stock market is enormous, which makes it easier for many companies to secure financing. It has even become one of the hotspots for private equity. Why? Because they have capital in abundance and a wealth of specialized professionals. In fact, do you remember that in 2024, former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi published a report commissioned by the European Union on competitiveness and why the old continent is falling behind? Well, that report said many things, but one of the things it highlighted as a model to follow was precisely this. Between 2015 and 2024, Sweden recorded more than 500 IPOs, more than Germany, France, and the Netherlands, and Spain combined. Let me repeat that. A country of 10 million people is taking more companies public than the 4 leading economies of continental Europe combined. It's absolutely crazy. Many SMEs in Sweden are able to raise capital to grow and finance new investments. At the same time, Swedes have a vast array of investment opportunities. But that's not all. Relatively recently, last April in fact, the Stockholm School of Economics published a study on what had happened to family-owned businesses following the abolition of the inheritance tax. And do you know what the result was? Well, take a look. This is exactly what the study says.
Grew faster, invested more, and paid higher corporate taxes than firms without natural heirs.
Do you understand what this means? The companies grew much more and much faster, became more competitive, and the government even ended up collecting more taxes. It lost out on inheritance tax revenue, yes, but in the long run, it ended up collecting much more in taxes thanks to the profits and jobs created by these companies. Why did this happen? Because basically, with the elimination of the inheritance tax, families that owned businesses were willing to continue investing heavily in them. The government was no longer going to take 70% of their value. So what happened to ordinary Swedes? Well, they benefited from the entire process. More jobs, higher wages, greater wealth, and in the long run, a government with more resources. Sweden's quiet revolution has been a resounding success.
Households' inflation-adjusted incomes have doubled on average since the 1990s, after stagnating during the 1970s and 80s under high taxation.
Today, the sense of prosperity that had disappeared has returned. Sweden has become one of the most dynamic business ecosystems in all of Europe. Companies like Skype, Klarna, and Northvolt were founded right there. And in fact, Sweden now has more billionaires per capita than in the United States. Yeah, you heard correctly. The so-called social democratic paradise, relative to its population, produces more multi-millionaire fortunes than the United States itself. And take note of this.
Considering the overall tax burden, Sweden is more attractive than the US.
Surprised? I'm not surprised. I'm sure this isn't the Sweden you imagined, but there's more to top it all off. We're not just talking about a political shift, but a cultural one as well. Today's polls show that Swedes are now more capitalist than the French, the Germans, the Spanish, or the Italians. And yes, you'll still find the occasional clueless person out there talking about the Nordic model. But do you want to hear an anecdote that I think really captures this shift? Well, check this out. Jacob Wallenberg, a member of Sweden's most powerful family, recalls that when he was a child in Sweden, there was only one Rolls-Royce in the entire country. These days, there are more than 800. In fact, do you know what Rolls-Royce did in 2016? It opened its first brick-and-mortar dealership in all of Scandinavia. And where? In Stockholm, of course.
Sweden is a real land of opportunity. I want people and capital to stay here and grow.
And take note, because the changes brought about by this quiet revolution aren't limited to tax and financial matters. They go much, much further. Starting with public services. Take a look. In the 90s, the government privatized the public housing stock. It also threw the healthcare and education sectors wide open to private competition. It even put private companies in charge of managing public facilities. The result? Today, in Sweden, nearly half of all primary care clinics are private. Many are owned by private equity funds. But there are also many public facilities that are managed by private companies. According to this system's own data, this has led to reductions in costs, waiting lists, and bureaucracy. For example, treating appendicitis in a fully public Swedish hospital costs between 15 and 20% more than doing so at a publicly owned but privately managed hospital. That's not to mention the impact in terms of innovation. For example, St. Goran's Hospital in Stockholm, which is publicly funded but privately managed, has been using artificial intelligence to detect breast cancer for 3 years. This has made it possible to drastically reduce waiting lists and achieve earlier diagnoses. And this is just one example from a country where, thanks to such initiatives, healthcare spending has increased much less than in other countries like the United Kingdom or the United States, while the results achieved are much better. The result? Even the Social Democrats support this mixed model. That's the case with healthcare, but with education, it's a very similar story. These days in Sweden, 1 in 3 public high schools is run by private operators. In 2011, the figure was 1 in 5. Today, it's already 1 in 3. And their market share continues to grow, mainly because families are increasingly seeking them out. And keep in mind that most of these operators are publicly traded companies. So there you have it. This is the new Sweden that's taking shape. Clearly, they still have many problems. In fact, in recent years, the country has been known above all for issues related to immigration and crime. We've talked about that here extensively on VisualPolitik. But economically speaking, this country has undergone such a drastic transformation that it simply no longer makes any sense to talk about that old Nordic model, because as much as it may bother the Mamdanis of the moment, that model no longer exists. Which, obviously, doesn't mean that Sweden is some kind of liberal utopia, not at all. The truth is that the political discourse is still quite social democratic. And with the elections coming up on the 13th of September, the shift to the left is quite pronounced. But of course, no one is suggesting a return to the old days anymore, basically because they realise that it simply doesn't work. But now that we've gotten this far, the questions are for you. Did you know about this dramatic shift in Sweden? What do you think of everything we've told you? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let's start a discussion. And if you found this interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so. Take care. I'll see you soon.